This is The War on Cars. I'm Doug Gordon. So you might call this episode the latest in an accidental series on motonormativity. Motonormativity is a shared bias whereby people use different standards when judging things related to cars than when judging other topics. Back in episode 99, we had Professor Ian Walker on the show to talk about what we called car brain. That was about his and his colleagues' research into the phenomenon. Then, in episode 140, we welcomed Dr. Tara Goddard on to discuss her research, which replicated Dr. Walker's UK-based studies in a US context. For this episode, we are continuing the conversation around motonormativity. We're also going to dive into language as a way of seeing our built environment and the choices we make, and consider the future of our communities. Okay, so our guest for this episode is a return visitor to the War on Cars. It's Marco to Brömmelstroet, also known as the Fietsprofessor online. That's Fiets, as in the Dutch word for bicycle. Marco holds the chair on urban mobility futures at the University of Amsterdam. He's also the founding academic director of the Urban Cycling Institute. And in his research, he uses Dutch cycling culture as a lens to study the two-way relations between mobility, the city, and society. He is also the author with Thalia Verkade of Movement, How to Take Back Our Streets and Transform Our Lives. And as I mentioned, we are welcoming him back to the podcast. He last appeared on episode 65, Where Are the Bike Lanes in Lego City? Marco to Brömmelstroet, welcome back to the War on Cars.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be back.
Yeah, it's been a long time since the Lego episode. I am biased because I produced that one. Still one of the most enjoyable conversations I had on the show.
But still, Lego does not have bicycle lanes. Well, it does and doesn't, right? So it
not as many as they should.
No, exactly.
I want to get right to your new study. It's called Why Do Cars Get a Free Ride? The Social-Ecological Roots of Motonormativity. You co-authored it with Professor Ian Walker, who I just mentioned at the top of the show. As the title suggests, it looks at the factors that create motonormativity, that give rise to the biases that we talked about with Professor Walker, with Professor Goddard. Could you perhaps explain the aim of this study and how you and Ian Walker decided to go about it?
Well, it started with you. So it started with Ian's talk about his work on your podcast and elsewhere. And I was listening to it, and it triggered my thinking, especially when he raised what at that time was a hypothesis, that he found motonormativity. He found this generic bias towards the norms that we apply around cars. And in the conversations online, he suggested that it might have something to do with the physical environment in which people live, that sort of reproduce these biases or even enforce them. And there he mentioned the notion that it might be very different in the Netherlands. And that triggered me. So what I did is I sent him an email and said, okay, I'm going to bet a bottle of wine on it that if we would study this phenomenon in the Netherlands, we would find a similar or even stronger motonormativity. Because I think it's not only the physical environment, it also has to do with the cultural history of the country. And that cycling in the Netherlands might even hide the problems of the car even better, because we also have this alternative. So he really liked this idea, and he said, let's try to study that. And normally you would then apply for funding, and it would be years later. But within a year, we managed to secure crowdfunding. The total cost of the study was €5,000 that we could use to get the data on this from 3 different countries, the US, the UK, and the Netherlands. That allowed us to not only study motonormativity across these contexts, but also try to figure out what was causing them. So this social spatial structure that we used to try and figure out what were the causal variables explaining it. And as it also happens often in research, we found a lot more.
So let's get into the nuts and bolts of how you conducted the study. You mentioned that you looked at it in 3 countries, the US, the UK, and the Netherlands, and got an international sample of a little over 2,000 people and asked them a series of questions, some of which were from Professor Walker's original study. Others were sort of copies of that, but with different language, and then a kind of new set of questions that got really into where they were getting ideas from.
Yeah.
But before we even get into that, I got to admit, I'm surprised that you thought it would be even worse in the Netherlands, because I think as an American and Professor Walker living in the UK, two countries where the built environment just screams cars everywhere, we would assume that people in the Netherlands have fewer of these biases, that people on bikes are seen to be having the same rights as people not on bikes, and people in cars, when we think about things like strict liability for crash victims and things like that. So I'm surprised that your instinct was this has got to be worse, and perhaps all of the cycling, all of the infrastructure might be hiding in a worse way the motonormativity you experience. Can you explain your thinking behind that before we get into the results?
Well, the first, so everybody was surprised, and actually the study finds that I was not exactly correct. But it led us to expand the idea that it cannot only be the physical environment, it also needs to be social, cultural. So we needed to have a wider lens to understand this. So that was one thing. But when Ian also said, well, this cannot be true, I asked him, what do you think that the average car ownership in the UK is if you compare it to the Netherlands? And most people would not know this, but in the Netherlands, the average car ownership is higher than in the UK. So what actually happened in the Netherlands, long story short, at least when I try to summarize the last 50 years, is we had the opportunity to really fight the car-based traffic engineering mindset that was taking over our cities until the 1960s and 70s. But we didn't. We, in the end, folded back this idea of cycling as an alternative. It folded back into traffic engineering. And cycling became a part of the mainstream traffic engineering, which made it so successful in the first place, but also takes out the whole activism, the whole idea that there is a radical alternative. So in the Netherlands, I would assume that people take it even more for granted that the system around us, which is still very car dominated, with around 10 million cars now, and a higher per capita car ownership than many countries around us. Yeah, we are suited in an environment where it seems to be all solved, right? You can also bike. So why would you even have an activist group? Why would you even ask critical questions about cars? Why would you even question paying for parking of a car? And because also in the Netherlands, in most parts of our cities, parking your car in public space is still free, or at least for the owner. It's not free for society. So I have several examples, but for instance, also in my house, I live here in a relatively suburban development in the middle of the country, where in front and behind my house, the municipality offers me free parking for a car. So I, on average, have 1.7 free parking spots for cars, and all my bikes need to be in the shed behind the house. So in that sense, I think that on many levels, we still see cycling as a niche. It is a niche that became part of the mainstream, and therefore we successfully developed it, but it's still a niche. And my key point is that I think that the truce that was signed in the 70s that say, okay, let's be on the table for cycling, came with a cost. And the cost was that we lost the radical activism. It doesn't exist anymore. We don't have people blocking streets in the Netherlands. Actually, if you would do that, your biggest opponent would be the Dutch Cyclist Union, because they are now also part of the regime that wants everybody to free flow everywhere, also on bikes.
This is why I love talking to you, because I think sometimes my goal as an advocate is to be seen as not all that radical.
Mm-hmm.
But what you're saying is that if you lose that radical side, then forward progress might not happen in the way that you want, or you can get stuck in a certain narrative, which I think is a big part of your research.
Yeah, exactly. So what you see in history of social movements is that you always need all of it, right? So you need people that are willing to sit at the table to do the negotiations. But these people have a much better position if there are also people outside screaming, shouting, or even using violence against objects. So we know this from history that almost all big progressive changes happened by having all of that. And I think this is one of the hidden costs of what the Dutch did. Is we got a lot. We have 27% of all trips in the Netherlands are by bike, and everybody loves that, and it's great, and we should cherish it. But it's also already 27% for more than 20 years now. So we're stuck, basically. We're stuck in a system where everybody got its own place. At the same time, we became very rich. So we have a perfect bicycle infrastructure, but we also have a perfect car infrastructure, and we also have to have a perfect train infrastructure, right? So it's a very expensive truce, and it's still costing the lives of 2 people every day, right? In the Netherlands, also small country, 17 million people, 18 million people, around 70 heavy traffic crashes every day. More than other places, I would say. It seems to be taken for granted. It's something accepted. We have road safety organizations, but all of them are paid by the car industry, and nobody finds that disturbing or weird. So I think that we lost that momentum, and it lures us into thinking that everything is fine, which it isn't.